people who travelled on the Windrush or on one of the boats that followed her during the 50s and early 60s. Our own parents had begun the transformation of our family at the start of the 50s, and so while much of what we were hearing felt deeply familiar, it could often be strangely dislocating to be jotting down an anecdote and then suddenly realize that we knew the same people, or that we'd lived in the same street, or that we'd been through the same experiences. Nevertheless, meeting that generation of men and women was extraordinarily instructive and exciting. Their voyage had been half a century ago, but many of them were still alive and active. Decades later, we found ourselves treasuring those encounters. There were Ulrich Cross, Dudley Thompson, and Sam King. Sybil Phoenix briskly admonishing teenagers twice her size. Cy Grant smiling kindly through an open doorway. Ronald Hall, United States Air Force veteran, dentist and father of our childhood friend Ian. Jessica Huntley holding out yet another book of poems she had published. David Pitt, later Lord Pitt, who cared for our mother while she was pregnant with her youngest child. All of them had been part of building the world we were trying to understand and describe. The world in which the migrants lived, however, was being shaped by very different forces. In the year before the Windrush docked, the process of Indian independence had begun. In Britain itself, the certainties of the immediate post-war years had started to weaken as the country struggled with the pressures imposed by the establishment of the welfare state. In the decade after the Windrush arrived at Tilbury, Britain found itself engaged in a variety of counter-insurgency campaigns. These began with the Malayan emergency, followed shortly by the struggle against the Mau Mau in Kenya. Then there was the campaign to suppress the anti-colonial AOCA in Cyprus and the culminating frenzy of Suez. All of these events challenged the familiar narrative of Commonwealth solidarity. During this time, the rhetoric of racial superiority emanating from citizens of the old white Commonwealth in southern and East Africa fueled mass disturbances in the streets of British cities. Stories about the revolt in Kenya, followed by the burgeoning violence in Rhodesia, created a racist undertow in which Caribbean migrants were seen as a species of fifth column. Rhodesian Prime Minister Ian Smith's unilateral declaration of independence in 1965 was a watershed which seemed to reinforce traditional prejudices and increase the vulnerability of black Caribbeans. The migrant presence we were describing, therefore, took on a different tone from the beginning of the 60s. The accounts of our parents' friends and their families became more defensive, and the Windrush adventure itself began to disappear from our story. Instead, its survivors focused on the consequences of their movement from one environment to another. The personalities emerging from this experience were already radically different. Throughout the 60s, the Caribbean migrants cemented their position as crucial builders of British institutions like the NHS and the nationalised railways. Our own father, for example, his wartime army service a distant memory, worked in the railways and then the post office. Our eldest sister qualified as a nurse, studied in Paris, then worked as a midwife in Glasgow, and following that, took up a position in London. Our mother sewed furs in a workshop near Clissold Park in Hackney. Like the broad variety of their compatriots who made the journey, they now saw the ships that had carried them simply as a bridge between the Caribbean and their new lives. There was a cost attached to their daily existence and survival. This came in the form of a pervasive tradition of racial discrimination which dominated our shared memories. The presence and the persistent visibility of the migrants continued to provoke controversy that, for a time, seemed to define us. Everyone with whom we discussed the 2 decades after the docking of the Windrush could describe personal experiences which fed into the public and political arguments that surrounded them. The Notting Hill riots of 1958 were followed by a decade of legislation aimed at ending the flow of Caribbean labour, and throughout the next decade, political figures would be defined by their position on the issue. Enoch Powell, for example, bought himself permanent notoriety with a speech at the end of the 60s in which he compared himself to a Roman senator, anticipating rivers of blood.